So good afternoon. My name is Dutra Brown. The title of this project is a representation of waiting, the Viljandi County Health Center. As the title suggests, I center the design of this project around a critical analysis of the medical waiting room. By holding the marginal space of the waiting room as the driver for this design, this thesis in exploring the physical and symbolic effects architecture has on the body, and in the case of the hospital program, architecture's direct ability to heal. So let's begin. For a place that is incredibly still, you sit. The medical waiting room is a place of radical transformation. It is a literal threshold, seen as it is not a final destination, but rather a temporary stop on our way to somewhere else. It is neither here nor there. It is a space that is only gray. The medical waiting room also marks a moment of an internal transformation as one's identity moves from person to that of patient. It is for these heterotopic qualities of the waiting room that I associate it with the previous study of mine, the rug. Being a powerful object for effectively demarcating space, the rug is an architectural tool in generating real personal territory through purely representing it by framing its user both in form and in graphic. The carpet also jumps scale, as the graphics and construction of early carpets were references to Persian gardens, otherwise known as paradise. This prompts the formal language of the project that began in the fall. I made a series of what I call blanketed landscape drawings. They are drawings that didn't respond to any particular program, but were interested in merging the large-scale language of landscape with a small-scale construction of the stitch. The craft of stitching is rethought through the architectural lens of drawing and becomes a tectonic linework with an inherent relationship between front and back. And these are some of the final images from that exercise. So I see a useful connection for thinking of the space of the waiting room and the abstract space of the rug side by side. Since the waiting room strips its occupant of agency through a sort of singling out of the individual, the other provides comfort to its user by referencing a larger community. The two together opens an opportunity for healthcare design that privileges the collective over the individual. This is in stark contrast to what we currently see as the trend in hospital design, which has been about an over-domestication of healthcare spaces. Purely interior design projects, they rely on a user-friendly, image-friendly language of tufted pastels and piped gold hardware. It is a language that is entirely familiar to us. We see it in the office spaces such as The Wing, a women-only co-working space that exhibits its female-friendly design through plush fabrics and rounded corners. It is also the same language seen in new flagships of the makeup company Glossier. The problem with healthcare adopting the same architectural language of consumer brands is that it relates healthcare and good healthcare to taste. It tells a false narrative that our fears and needs will not be recognized in an institutional setting. But healthcare is not a consumer good like mascara, but a civic right. And it should not go without mentioning that the language these healthcare clinics have adopted stem from consumer brands that target women, and women of a certain age, race, and affluence. This is of particular interest to this project since the Viljandi Health Center is one of 3 county hospitals in the area. Amongst other services, this new location has been designated for all of the obstetrics and gynecology departments in the area, and therefore the majority of patients at this hospital will be women. While the carpeted landscape provides a formal language for this project, it also anchors it to a particular history in architecture. The historical implications of the carpet, as described by Aaron Betsky in his book Building Sex, is one that ties the first moments of architecture to the labor of women in early nomadic society. Women did the weaving of the carpets, women possessed the knowledge of tent construction, and these tents were constructed and organized around a fire, which women were in charge of tending to. It was an act of placemaking centered around and for community. So the form of this building derives by thinking of the waiting room as one large interior landscape. So if traditionally we see a series of small waiting rooms sprinkled throughout the hospital divided by department, this hospital aggregates those waiting spaces into one. Certain outpatient services take place within this waiting scape and are dispersed like follies. The waiting landscape is signaled through its roof, which touches down on the site at 2 of its corners, becoming a new ground. It is also it's a public terrain and sloping park, but it is also a functional amenity to the hospital so that patients in rehabilitation have access to an outdoor space for exercise and physical therapy. The material of that top surface supports this by being slightly soft and spongy for patients. It's a synthetic rubber with no added pigment, so sort of how you can imagine a clear silicone to be, and that is sprayed on top of a panelized perforated metal surface. And this allows for light to filter into the waiting space below. And just to ground this in a little bit of reality, I'm thinking of the construction technique used on those rubber mulch playgrounds. And so while this hospital is looking at a different color palette, I'm just using this as an example for technique. But I get very excited about this because that spray-on rubber as a final layer would give a very clean and monolithic look to that surface from aerial view, which has clearly been a way that I have been working and looking at this project. And so the ward block of the hospital, which is where all of the beds are for people staying long-term, is intentionally placed on the east face of that taller muted building next to this waiting-scape so that all of the rooms can look out on top of the landscape. That muted building is meant to support its formal counterpart in every way, both visually as kind of blank backdrop, and this is an idea that is carried through elevation and into plan. And it also supports the roof literally as 2 arms lift the roof into locations. The synthetic material language mixed with its organic form creates a new natural and one that speaks to the program of the 21st century hospital. So underneath this undulating roof is an interior landscape of waiting space. Outpatient services like eye exams, yearly checkups, and vitals take place within this waiting-scape, and they are placed almost like follies, keeping in mind their adjacencies to one another in order to maintain efficiency. They break up the otherwise constant arrangement of seating, which is aligned to an overscaled tile pattern that starts to echo the carpet's concept of framing and notion of personal territory that I'm pushing forward. In this plan, you can see how some of those follies that I'm talking about. There is a range of types of exam rooms, from more solid containers of very private rooms to lighter clusters, to even some rooms that remain open for more routine events like the checking of vitals. And the idea is similar to hiding in plain sight, that the more activity that happens in this space, the more privacy for the patient. There are some other services within this waiting-scape, like pharmacy. This is what I call the reflection chamber, which is just a quiet space for meditation or prayer, similar to how you find chapels near the lobby of hospitals. And so that's what this rock is. You can enter it, and it's a big cavernous space. And some of this language sort of spills out onto the site. This is that outdoor seating area that's populated with these ventilation units that are brushed off the top of that surface of the roof and incorporated into the landscape. So I'm going to zoom into the plan a little bit. Through the arrangement of these services, coupled with the variety of ceiling heights from the undulating roof, a gradient of waiting space is provided. The material palette is a remix of materials that are known to the hospital: plastics, white tile, the kind of cloth-like draping of the roof, little like mounds of rubber that kind of hit at the end of these columns to be lounged on. And of course, the quality of light coming through that surface is very important. And you can see up in the distance, those 2 arms that are extending out from the mid-rise building so that patients in long-term recovery can do their laps and be an active part of that space by looking down into it below. So through the design of this imagined waiting-scape, this project hopes to reclaim the hospital typology as an architectural project and one that belongs to public urban infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you, Dutra. That was beautiful.
Well, I'll kick it off. Dutra is an amazing presentation. First of all, absolutely amazing. I'm a little bit familiar with some of your work from last semester. You did a wonderful kind of overlap, I think, between thesis research and other projects that you've done to carry it through. Just really, really amazing. I wanted to ask one question about, and I love the critique of the, you called it the over domestication of healthcare, which I thought was really interesting. And you also called, I think, waiting rooms gray at one point. And then when we kind of end and you finally get us inside, you know, into your world, like what about the actual materiality that we're looking at? Because you're dealing with, in a beautiful way, a level of abstraction where it so becomes very spatial, and I understand that. But I just wanted if you could fill in a little bit with that about, let's say, the aspects of color or materiality a little bit more.
I was focusing more on texture, a difference in texture rather than a difference in color. And I was aiming to kind of create a new institutional material palette and sort of riff on materials that are already kind of known or familiar to the hospital program. So the white tile became really important to sort of intensify the space, also to make it seem larger, since it kind of creates this continuing grid other than the point where it sort of crumples and folds up onto that rock that's placed in the middle. I'm excited about like this idea of like this synthetic rubber sort of silicone being used, and I think like the material palette for me is like the newest part, I guess, of this project. It's the most recent, and if I was to continue, I would want to continue with more like material samples, because right now it does remain very abstract.
Well, it's interesting because it's not, I think, so Dutra, to echo what John said, and you know I've said this to you before, but yes, like a sort of a beautiful essay. You presented us with an essay on the cultural status of healthcare and a very sophisticated critique of the gender and consumer norms that are unthinkingly put forward in the West. And particularly, interestingly enough, considering that your project is not in the United States, it's almost as though it's a U.S.-based critique applied to a context that may or may not share some of the same weaknesses. But I do wonder if actually the palette that you end with, which is almost no palette at all, is really all that different from the Glossier millennial pink that you critique so eloquently. I also think that this project, with the kind of simple and I think very, very elegant gesture of the kind of tissue box and the tissue next to it, would live or die by its tectonics. It would live or die by actually the way that it was produced, by the how the glazing was detailed, how the roof actually would touch the supports. How those two arms would actually tie into the tissue box, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I find it both fascinating and frustrating that you never developed that.
You know, I'm going to come in from a completely different point of view here. I really think your presentation is beautiful, and it just stitches, no pun intended, together in terms of how you set your whole argument with the landscape, with the rug, with your interest in the rug providing a certain a territory, and territory in the waiting room is really important, because you sit in the waiting room and you are sharing that personal space with other people who are waiting there. And so when I look at your project, and it's a very, very large waiting room, and I start seeing how you kind of position those the seating in a grid on top, you know, and each one has its own individual domain within a very, very large space. And I actually am really, really intrigued by that, because you took on a completely different position of what one would expect a waiting room to be. And because you started criticizing this over domestication of healthcare, and criticizing the kind of sherbet cream color and the rounded corner and everything. So clearly you were trying to break away from that, but at the same time, the rug and the carpet and the landscape soften up the space. But then at the same time, if you look at your plant, it is a grid. So I really appreciate the juxtaposition between those two, and in particularly something that I would have never thought when I saw the final presentation. I said, "Oh, this is a vast place," but one could feel that you own your own waiting area, and I think that's, to me, is the most fascinating aspect of your project. I mean, besides the landscape and how you weave in the organic and the grid together in your plan. Yeah.
I also,
Dave.
I think this, yeah, I absolutely love this project. And it's so strange that in a way that you started with it before the pandemic kind of had its biggest effect on us, because it seems like a response to that, but it's not. The response is something much bigger. And one of the things I like so much about it is you're taking on a kind of area that you're totally right is not really, there hasn't been much contribution by architects to this kind of institutional space. And also to what you really rightly describe as a kind of almost like dehumanizing moment of transfer from individual to object within a machine. And I don't know, that opened up to me this idea of like really taking on, in a larger sense, a lot more of these institutional spaces. And I think I know that's not the intent of your thesis, but it just seems like such a cool thing to work on nowadays, especially when everything's in question with architecture, and what are people going to work on now, and is it all developer work and single family residences and all that, and maybe that's something that's not as valuable to work on. I don't know, but it's such a cool project. My favorite moment was when we went into the interior, and you had like this strange stack of stuff. Like I didn't know really what it was, but it felt so informal, and the informality of stacking these parts and then draping your carpet over top. It did exactly what you said it would do. It reminded me of some sort of like these archetypal moments from human history or something, and it really connected me with your project. I thought that was a brilliant move. I mean, I don't know about all that exposed structure on the bottom side of the roof, and if that doesn't snap you into some different reality than you want us to be in. But in a way, it fits. I don't have a problem with it at the end of the day, because it fits with your kind of informality. Like you're almost like not overworking it. You're just like, yeah, I need some structure, and I'm going to do that, and then put this on top, and I get it. So it's, in a way, it's consequent, and I don't have a complaint about it. But I think it's just awesome, and I love not only the object, but just the way you carved out this new territory. It's really making me think. I'm sure it's making a lot of people think about what are we working on, and what are our values, and where should we put our energy in now that the world's kind of changed around us.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in with that too. I think what it really excites me about the thesis, Dutra, is that not only are you taking the design project quite seriously and your talents are laid bare, but you've really attempted to kind of shift the way that we even talk about let's say the terms of what constitutes an architectural discussion, or perhaps you could start to shift it towards issues that are perhaps political in the sense of the world political issues, looking at kind of the issues of femininity, obviously healthcare, all these things that I think are right now in the world becoming more and more things that we can't ignore. And I think what I like about this as an undergrad thesis is that it seems like it allows you to point forward with a way to shift even the kinds of terms you might use to talk about architectural effects. Or when Marika says essay, I'm curious about that. Like, I like the idea that maybe we could all disagree, but I like the idea that you could sort of shift towards a kind of essay making through architecture. Maybe that's the political moment larger outside of architecture that we're in right now, is to find ways to do that. So I like that the project begins to speak to a really broad audience and a disciplinary audience at the same time. I think it sort of has a lot of legs for you in your future. And anyway, I just want to say it's quite beautiful and congratulations. But I think it wasn't, to me, it was more than a presentation. It was a sort of pointing at new possibilities of, I don't want to use the word critique or discipline, but like new possibilities of let's say, content for what we focus on as a discipline. I like that. No.
I want to, of course, hear what our guests have to say, but I can't help but jump in here and say this is really fantastic and really stimulating project. What I find so amazing going on with David's point and Tom's is the range of scales, you know, that you go from the detail to the healthcare system, all the way up to the healthcare system and all the way down to the detail. And I think that's a breakthrough, because generally the discussion is on one or the other end of strategy or detail. And I think also your generation, it's the opportunity to move out beyond the little project while maintaining the design sensibility and focus on the little project, on the up close. And so I think it's a breakthrough in terms of really going all the way up and challenging the healthcare system itself. So that's tremendous.
Don't forget that when Montaigne coined the word essay, he was literally using the French essai, an attempt. And I think that's the strength of this project, but also the part that remains still for you to do. That's one thing that I love about this project, is it's the beginning of something. It's the first essay. And Dutra, I just want to encourage you to keep that and keep working on this and refining it and turn it into something that can revolutionize not just the world of ideas, but also the world of ideas as they hit the ground. In other words, architecture itself. That's
a really beautiful way to look at it. I love that.
I mean, the example, Dutra, that I couldn't help but think of as you started. Sorry, can you hear me all right? I can't tell if I'm on. Yeah. The obvious comparable to that sort of an approach would be an architect-trained journalist that 100 years ago became fascinated with exactly your kind of spaces, and that of course is Siegfried Krakauer's work on the lobby. And what he focuses on in the end, in the early 20th century, with the rise of industrialized space of all kinds, of these kind of peculiar spaces that sit outside the world of architecture normally, like cathedrals and houses and things that had deep cultural histories, to focus on those spaces that suddenly emerge in the modern world that appear to have no meaning at all. But of course, he does a sort of perfect Marxist literary critic turn by making them the most important kind of spaces on the planet, for precisely the way they equalize everybody's estrangement to those sort of moments, like a hotel lobby. We literally don't know what to do in them. And in that way, we're all the same. And, you know, it's hard not to think of the waiting room in that form. And I'm, I suppose, less interested in the waiting room and its relationship to a hospital, particularly sadly, now that we're living in a moment where that sort of a space is being taken away entirely from the modern hospital. UCLA had to announce 2 or 3 weeks ago that for the first time in the history of Reagan Hospital, there will now be no waiting rooms because they're too dangerous. So you're taken from carside into your room, the few people that are still using hospitals, and very few are anymore. But I just love the moment at which architects grab onto something just as it's disappearing from the world. And you've sort of captured that really beautifully. And so I'm going to set aside the medical side of this, as interesting as it is, to say the other thing, of course, is that nearly every kind of modern space that we know of includes something like a waiting room or that kind of a space. And, you know, as scary as they are in hospitals, I promise you, they're just as scary in dean's offices or accountants' offices or lawyers or I suppose, when you're going through the admissions process in a school. So I think you're touching on something even bigger than just the sort of medical or hospital side of things. But I think the one thing that I would really want to applaud you on is that you grounded your presentation with sharing a little bit of how you tried to imagine connecting this semester. Now, if I understand it right, this is your last semester in school with the previous work that you've done. And in a funny way, that's the unspoken side of an architecture school. You know, the job of most teachers is to get you to forget about the last semester so that you'll do their project in their studio. And the psychological warfare is, and the self-making side, the subjectivity side of an architecture school is your ability to steer that and to form a sort of self or project that lives beyond the randomness of architectural careers or student assignments in a school. And I just love the idea that you were trying to think through how to take the rug into this very peculiar, almost 19th century expectation that you had to now make a building to qualify and graduate as an architect. And in fact, that is something that's 100 years old as a pedagogical assumption, and it's certainly something that you beautifully undermined with the observations you made about a rug maybe being a more important surface than anything that we would make in terms of space. And maybe the one decision it looks like you took that would be open for discussion and question is why the move from a rug to the scale of a building demanded a kind of drapery instead of just another three-dimensional form of a pattern or surface. You know, everything you're saying about your project to me would work without the undulations and folds that make it look like contemporary architecture of the last 10 or 15 years. And I think that's some of that would be one of the things for you to continue to think about as you go forward. I would totally, like some of your co-conspirators 50 or 60 years ago in Italy, totally imagine a sort of Archizumi interior in which every surface was orthogonal, but exactly the same kind of disposition of weighting activities and diagnoses and other things that are taking place could still happen on that surface. And it would probably end up looking a lot more like a parking garage than digital architecture of the late 1990s. And I'm not sure that'd be a problem. But you're really touching on, for me, those sort of big questions about how to connect one piece of one project to another, which is going to set you up perfectly as you go forward, I think. Because this time next year, you're not going to have any of these wonderful people sitting on a Zoom screen with you talking about your work. It's really going to be about how you find a way to take this forward into its next iteration. And it's just great to see, I think, in a presentation that you're thinking about that actively.
Yeah, I wanted to add too, because I witnessed it, you took this sensibility, which I mentioned to our studio in the fall, and you did 2 competitions, which were other tests of this same formal setup. One was a house and the other was actually a city. It was interesting to me because as Brett says, you know, and it's not, you brought this already, I think, from prep and your work with Kristy into the studio I was in. So I take no claim of this at all, but it was interesting to watch you do it. And of course I encouraged it and was all for it. But one other thing I wanted to mention, and there's invention in this on a lot of levels, but the idea of oversizing the lobby, extracting it out of the building, and then also programming it, because you mentioned there's other, you know, you can get your temperature taken, you can get certain kind of things done that are also programmatic out of the hospital, which also activate that kind of new way. It's I think you've brought activity, both formal and visual, but actual activity to that. There's something to do, which is of course part of the rooms aren't just how they're designed, it's the situation one's in, literally waiting, worrying, anxiety, etc. And we've all been in them. But I think that was really brilliant as an architectural diagram and idea, beyond all the other things that you've done. And when you can do all those things and hit all of those different aspects, I think it makes it even stronger. So great.
I think the idea of looking at a women's hospital, gynecological department and so on is very, very important. So about 60 years ago, my mum had an operation in order to have kids. It's my sister's birthday today. And later in life, my mum had to have a hysterectomy. And so I don't look upon this is a rug. I look upon it as a blanket. And I think about a mother cuddling a child, tucking a child up in bed, you know, the warm embrace of a mother, or when you come out of the ocean and your mum wraps you in a blanket. And so I regard it more like a blanket because it's to do with a very serious subject. So the question is, can a building give you a loving embrace? So when you go to this building, you are nervous. You might be with a son or a daughter. You're anxious, and I thought your phrase, the moment when you're still a person and then you're about to become a patient, is particularly poignant at this time. And so this building, this blanket, if we talk about the architecture of the senses, I'm not sure you can get a loving embrace from a white space. And I think that it's to do with the architecture of the senses. You know, if you walk in there, your eyes are the things that stimulate your brain so much. So I think you said you were in Estonia. So in the winter, can the lighting of the blanket change? Can it affect your circadian rhythm before you go in? Can it calm you down? The things you smell, the things you taste, the things you touch, before you go in, can they relieve anxiety? As you exit, you might be incredibly upset. So where is the place underneath this blanket where you need to go? You've become a person again, but you're frightened. And where can you go? And how can the building then, at a smaller scale, give you comfort? What's the material that you sit on? You know, do you hear falling water? Do you see the landscape framed outside? Do you start to be engaged with being alive?
I think that you could definitely tie it into the blanket, and you know, it is there. For me, I was always more interested in the carpet's sort of connection back to an idea of community and how that tied into the programmatic move of making the waiting space so big. And it was a bigger move than I think like cuddling somebody. It was about creating a space for a large group of people. I think it's also important to point out that it's not a women's hospital only, but it is the location where all the women's services will be, meaning that the hospitals down the street don't have those services. So it's not only a women's hospital, but I think I'm more so interested in this idea about the community back to the individual and less so about a blanket swaddling metaphor.
What I didn't say was, in all of that, was I actually really like it as a project. And I liked when you spoke about seeing it as a park and you look up and the whole health and well-being side of things and people running and all of that. I thought it was really, really nice. Yeah. So I just recollect, I never actually said that I actually really like the project. So I do.
Dutra, could I ask you a quick question? I think it kind of goes off this comment. You just said like the word metaphor for swaddling. I'm kind of curious where you see not just this project, but this kind of work intersect the, let's say, looking towards either a feminist discourse or towards a different set of references that are more coming from, you know, women's work with, let's say, rugs in this case, towards the design proposal, which kind of is in between the metaphor, like the kind of large rug or the large blanket, in that the way that sort of may or may not intersect an actual sense of how it performs in a different way of, let's say, caring for people or organizing people in new ways or actually producing more rugs or something like this, or whether the materials are soft, etc. I'm curious, like, it seems like it sort of hits on a couple of those, some more than others. Like, do you see like this way of working as becoming something that should, like if this thing didn't have a blanket, but it did everything else you're talking about, is it the same kind of project? I'm curious about this like metaphor, not metaphor question for the thesis.
I mean, it was certainly my way in. I don't think I would have ended up here without it. But I think like in a more general I think those drawings started out very formal, like from the fall. And speaking more generally, like I hope to be able to continue to always relate these kind of formal drawings and decision making with logic that comes from outside of just the architectural discourse, and kind of like looks around at our kind of current contemporary situation. I'm not sure if that answers you.
I mean, one of the interesting things, Dutra, as you continue to develop it, is to think of ways to draw a project like this that might sit outside the conventions of just a sort of aerial mass model that shows a rectilinear object on the left and a foldy surface on the right. And one of the things that it begs with this wonderful idea you have to inflate the scale of the waiting room to a massive surface compared to the little tiny cell that I'm about to enter into as a patient, is that it's begging questions around how we're actually going to make that what is that route or journey like? Like, you've introduced an interesting problem to hospital life. Instead of the waiting room sitting next to the bed that I'm going to spend the next few weeks in, you've pulled those apart deliberately. But it seems like it would then demand that you think of ways to describe that experience that are probably different than just drawing a plan that would show the extreme small cell on the left and the big open surface on the right. That it could be a visual journey. It could be more like it would almost be like a little mini road movie. Like, I'd be walking 300 meters now suddenly to go from like my name being called to I've been looking up into this wall of little cells that people are lying in, staring at the ceiling, in an architecture that's all about the making of a ceiling. And how you move from the one to the other would be a really terrific thing for you to speculate on how best to draw or image. Because my hunch is it's going to make all of those conventions that right now are probably, that we're looking at on the screen is sort of familiar drawing conventions for a certain kind of project, less useful as a technique to make decisions about what that's going to actually become as a journey. Like, it'd be a really interesting project for you to try and draw that trip. Some would do it almost like a film strip or a series of, like a Bernard Schoenemy, like a series of diagrams that would show flow and movement. Others would do it almost like a film director storyboarding that 10-minute experience, or even longer, like a 20-minute trip to get from my name being called to upstairs to where all the action is going to be. But those are the discoveries in the project that for you, and maybe the thing that as you continue to work on it going forward, that you've got to develop answers to on your own terms, which would be really great. And we don't know off the top of our head. It's hard to predict what might be the best way to show that, but that's definitely the consequence of the project to this point, and that's a really great thing to have uncovered.
Well, one question I have is about this idea of style, which is sort of the critique of some contemporary interior stuff like the wing or whatever. That some idea of style is also, you're critiquing like a notion of gender that's popular now, and it's a bunch of issues, I think, to pull into an architecture project, and it's kind of, I'd be curious to hear more about that from you and from Kristy. But one thing that that I think of as maybe a counter argument is that the general gist of, say, I assume that kind of a lobby, or perhaps in a more fancy realm like Stephen Hall's work around Maggie's room or Maggie's hospital, whatever. There's a series of cancer treatment places he's been doing over time, and even Morphosis, who did a cancer room at Cedars-Sinai. There's this idea that architects have been involved in, which is how to let's say, reduce the dehumanization of hospitals and waiting rooms in general. And in your case study, you had some Kaiser Permanente plans, but not photographs, and then you had the photographs that were the plushies, shall we say. But I feel like you maybe created a little bit of a straw man in your argument, like using a kind of gender critique as a way of combating what's going on with hospital rooms, as opposed to maybe engaging in them fully in terms of how people are trying to make it more, what's a better way to make it more comfortable? So if we look at your project as a kind of a more humanizing approach, I do think it works almost as on the level of civic space. I mean, I think it's kind of funny how gigantic it is compared to the hospital rooms, and I would say that the hospital rooms do not reflect state-of-the-art hospitals, which tend to have, nursing stations and surround. They actually sort of create like a 12-unit domestic unit. Like the domestic model it's meant to be an improvement, I think, on the more military barracks kind of organization that hospitals used to have. But that aside, if we look at your plan, it reminds me very much of like the Parc de Balliet competition. So it's almost a kind of a postmodern idea of an urban plaza, you know, with these different pieces in it. And I think that's kind of interesting. I kind of wonder though, couldn't that just be the whole hospital? Like why can't the rooms be part of this compound, sort of have a connection? I feel like there's a sort of artifice in like taking these different parts apart and then just expanding on one of them. But I guess my to back it up, the issue of like style and gender as, you know, critically dangerous, I feel like is I'm not sure I totally agree with that.
I guess like what I was thinking is that a lot of those sort of, I mean, the first major distinction is that, you know, those are a language used at boutique private clinics versus this being a county hospital and being responsible for a lot more people. And I really see those sort of interior plushy kind of that style that's kind of like an image-based thing having a lot to do with the idea of just entertainment as like a distraction, I think, from those spaces. And I in my sort of like waiting landscape, I was thinking a lot about how, you know, gardens and sort of landscape design was sort of a spatial example of entertainment beyond just color and palette. And so like the programmatic move of having certain services within that waiting room is really important to me. But thinking of the overall space as an entertainment rather than just like sort of like visual poppy colors.
But so it is another notion of style, right? It's a different style. It's a style that's maybe more related to some of those more, I guess, 80s or 90s issues about rethinking public space and landscape and using literally like the confetti process for designing the layout, you know, as opposed to the linear corridor. Like, I guess I just think you could kind of get more analytical about it in architectural terms, and that maybe using the gendering stuff, it kind of puts you in hot water because you're also using a sort of gendered idea of making space by using the women-made rug thing. Like I feel like it's a little messy. As a feminist, you know, critic, I'd kind of like to see my critique a little more tidy.
Okay.
If there's not any, Dutra, do you have any final comments? This has been an incredible conversation, which I knew you were going to host. It's been amazing to work with you. I've watched you from afar. I've been at SCI-Arc 4 years. You've been here 5. So when I came in, I was always aware of the work that you were doing throughout. It was always highlights throughout the semesters. So it was really enjoyable to work with you this semester. You certainly brought your project, led it, and really hosted a robust conversation today. And I'm very proud of you and excited to see what you do next. Thank you very much.
And thank you to Kristy for the semester. And I mean, David and John, you're in the room. So like all my instructors, it's been a good 5 years. So.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you
Congratulations,
so much.
Thanks, Dutra.
Dutra. It was really awesome.
I can't wait to see you
Congrats.
again soon in person.
Dutra, I just want to say too, what an intellectual leader you've been, and that it's so great how many students look up to you and watch you, and we're really going to miss you at the school.
Thank you. Thanks.
Absolutely.
All right.
All right. Thank you.
Well done,
Goodbye.
well done. Bye-bye.
To our jury, we have a 5-minute break.